Woodcraft since 1928, providing traditional and modern woodworking tools and supplies to generations of craftsmen. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Oh, hi, come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to wood carving. When people find out you're a wood carver, one of the things you often get asked is to carve a sign. Now, signs aren't one of my favorite things, but they can be a lot of fun, and this is a good project, especially if you're starting out. Let me show you how to get started with a sign carving. First of all, you need an idea of what type of lettering to use. I usually go to a calligraphy book that's got some different samples in there, and that gives you an idea of what you can use that'll look good for your sign. Each type style has a different flavoring. This Roman style has a lot of vertical lines, and it's a good, easy to read lettering style, although it looks a little bit formal. On the other hand, you can have something like different old English styles that look real fancy, but they're kind of hard to read. The style I chose for the sign here is sort of a nice, easy, italic script. Let me show you how we get started with that. This sign is one for a friend of mine who has a cabin called calumet, and that's a word associated with the Indians. It goes back a ways, and it means peace or peaceful. It has to do with the peace pipe legends. And to get started on a sign like this, take a piece of paper to draw out your pattern. You draw a line for the top to show the height of your letters, and a line for the bottom to show where your letters are going to be sitting. Now, for doing this type of script, a lot of times I'll just lay out the letter freehand. But I was able to go to an art supply store, and I found these nifty little templates that I could use to trace with. So I just took these and then traced out my design onto the sign. Now, the thing you have to be careful with in doing signs is you want to make sure that your letters are evenly spaced. And that gets a little tricky because it doesn't mean that you can space each letter, say, like 1 inch or 2 inches apart. The distance varies depending on what the letter is. And there's no hard and fast rule for it that I've found that really works. The only thing I've been able to do is just kind of put your letters out and eyeball it, shift them around until it looks right. For example, on this sign here, we have a C and an A. And because we're dealing with two letters that kind of come at angles, you can bring them quite close together. Actually bring this A into the space of the C slightly if you had to. Whereas with the L and the U, and of course with the end of the A here, these are all vertical lines. So you want to have a little more space between these so they don't look too crowded. And when we got over here to the M and the E, my original pencil tracing on this, when I held it back and looked at it from a distance, it looked just a little bit too close. So what I did was I went and I shifted that letter over about 1/2 inch, and then I had to shift the T over a corresponding amount, and a little bit extra than that first 1/2 inch. Make your mistakes on paper first. Don't try to freehand your sign on the wood unless you're really good at lettering. When you get your sign all on the paper, then take a piece of tape and tape it down from each end and put some carbon paper under it, and then just trace your letters down onto the wood. And that's what I did to get the sign I've got here. When you're carving a sign or a piece of wood this big, a nice bench is a good idea to have. Something that's fairly sturdy and isn't going to move around on you. This is a nice woodcarver's bench. And it's easy to hold a large board like this because I've got these little adjustable, they call them bench dogs. And you can tuck those in and just sort of slide that down below the thickness of the wood. And then you set your wood in, tighten your vise down, and everything's held into place. And then you can start carving. One of the nice things about doing a sign like this is, for the style of carving I'm using, it's called an incised style, where I'm just carving a V down on the inside of the letter. Now, if you want to get fancy, you can also carve away the background and leave the letter raised, but that takes a little more time and it takes some more sophisticated tools. If you're a beginner, you can do this entire sign with just one tool. In this case, I'm using a number 8, 10 millimeter wide gouge. And this is a good size because I can use it to fit around all these different curves I'll be working on. So, once you have your sign laid out, you can tear into it. One of the reasons I chose this style of carving on this is because I like the fluted edges that it gives. And that reminds me of the texture that I used to see on arrowheads that I'd find out in the fields when I was growing up as a boy. It's a good idea when you're carving to be able to switch your hands. And this is a good project for doing that with. You can work from one side, then switch and use your hand from the left-hand side. And that saves you having to take your piece of wood up and move it right around. You see, it gives us a nice little texture there that looks sort of like the texture you find on arrowheads. And I thought that'd be fitting for this sign because it's being an Indian name, it kind of has sort of the nice flavor that goes along with it. Now I'll shift around and approach it from the other side here. I'm carving the sign in basswood, so a lot of it can be done just by powering the tool with your hand. There's a number of different woods you can use for carving signs. Just about anything, really, as long as the wood is fairly straight-grained. This basswood is nice because I can just go ahead and carve it nice and quick. It's not as weather-resistant as some woods. If you get a piece like cypress or cedar, you can hang it right outside and it'll last a long time in the weather. This one is going to be under my friend's porch, so it'll be protected from the elements. The word calumet has kind of an interesting history. It was a word that the early French explorers used to describe the Indian peace pipes, and it comes from the French word chalumeau, which referred to the stem of the pipe because they thought it looked like a reed. And eventually the word became to be associated with a peace pipe. And it was a very important part of the American Indians' culture. Marquette, one of the early explorers up in the Mississippi region, said that the peace pipe, or the calumet, was one of the most revered and mysterious and respected of the Indians' symbols. And you could take that pipe and display it and walk right through the middle of a battlefield, and the people just lay down their weapons, just stop dead right there. And I suppose for an explorer at those times it was kind of a handy token to be carrying around. A lot of Indians did wood carvings too. One of the kind we're most familiar with is the Northwest Coast Indians, who did all those magnificent totems. And they survived quite well because they're made of cedar, and a lot of them were done fairly recently. I mean, up towards the into the turn of the century even. Some of the other Indian carvings didn't survive very well, and that's partly because wood is a very perishable material. If you leave it laying around in the damp ground for very long, the fungus will attack it, and it doesn't take long for it to turn back into dirt, really. Some of the best Indian carvings that have survived were done by the Kaskaskia tribe, which is part of the Illinois Federation. And these Indians had a territory up through northern Illinois and what is now Iowa and Missouri. And they had some excellent carvings that were very well skilled and used as part of their religious rituals. What's interesting is a lot of this was done before they even had metal tools. And for a lot of this they would use flint, which you can sharpen down to a razor edge. It doesn't hold an edge long, but you can do a bit of work with it. And also a lot of work was done with copper. What they do is take raw copper ore and just work it between stones and pound it. And after you pounded it for quite a while, you could actually harden the copper to a point where it would hold an edge for a while. Now to clean this out, you can take a V-gouge and just come around here and clean out any of the fuzzies in the center. One of the interesting things about using this particular lettering technique for doing signs is it's almost as fast, and probably a little faster once you get going, than using an electric router. Also, it's a lot more fun and it's a lot safer too. It has kind of a nice feeling to it. Sign carving's been quite an interesting American tradition. Signs were a very important part of communication. And the reason they had carved signs, well, in this country dating back to colonial times, was because the paint stayed in the carvings better than if it was just painted on a board. If you just had it on a board, the weather would eventually clear that out pretty quick. And sign carving was a very popular form of advertising and decoration. And it's making a nice comeback in our country, too. There's a lot of places, particularly in the East Coast and the West Coast, where people have carved signs for their businesses or carved signs for their houses and addresses. It's kind of a nice tradition because there's just something about a carved sign that gives you sort of a feeling of warmth and, well, informal grace that you don't get with a neon sign or any other type of advertising. There's a lot of carvers that specialize in doing sign carvings, and I guess they make a fairly comfortable living at it. Sign carving isn't one of my favorite things because, well, I don't like laying out the letters. I'd rather be able to just take a big block of wood and whack away at it. But this is a good project. It's a fun project. And it's nice to be able to make one for your house or your cabin or whatnot. They make nice gifts, too. They're not very hard to carve, and it's a very personalized sort of thing that you can give a friend for a special occasion. And as you can see, it goes along very quickly here, too. One of the things I really enjoy about a project like this is the carving doesn't require a lot of concentration. This technique is fairly simple, and you can just start carving along and really sort of concentrate on the feeling of the tool going through the wood, and it really gives you, a feeling that you're sort of in touch with history. And you're actually carrying on an old tradition, an old honored tradition that dates back for centuries. sort of brings out the historical romance in people. Just take and clean this up around here. I'm not going to worry about making these too neat because I'm going to paint them in a few minutes when I get done. And of course that'll be good because it keeps the weather out, and also it'll help the sign be readable from a distance. One of the things you have to remember when you're carving signs, or designing the sign to be more accurate, is make sure that you can read the letters from a distance. For example, if you want to have something by the side of a road where people may be looking at it from 50 feet away, you're going to want letters that are fairly tall. These letters are only about 4 inches tall, and on the board here it looks pretty good sized. But if you're to take the sign and put it out in front of a house, or say put it out on the gate post, these letters are going to get small real fast when you start backing away from it. As a general rule of thumb, when I'm carving signs, what I usually do is figure out what I think is about the right size for the lettering. Then I make it 50% bigger. And that always works out about right. You can also take, and when you get done with one side of the sign, you can flip it over and carve the other side, and then hang it on a gate post so it can be read from both directions. And that's kind of a nice touch too. You can see how handy it is being able to switch hands, because I can just take and work left-handed with a tool here, or work right-handed, and it saves having to get around and walk around the board or take the board out from the vise. You can really approach this wood from just about any direction that way. Now, when you get your sign done, you may want to put a little paint on the letter so it's easier to read. I've got some mixed up here. Took a little oil color and thinned it out with turpentine. And I used a little cadmium red and a little burnt sienna just to kind of tone it down a bit. And I'm just going to paint these letters in. Then when I get done with the sign, what I'll probably do is take and paint it with a coating of exterior varnish, good spar varnish or a good polyurethane or something. And that'll protect the wood. The thing you want to remember when you're doing that is make sure you paint all the sides of your carving. Don't just put it on the outside here, put it on the back, and put it on the edges as well. And that'll seal the moisture from it. You can also do decorations in a sign like this. You can do relief carving and decorate, put a picture of a loon or trees or whatever you want to around the borders. And a little decoration goes a long way. And it's one of those things, it looks, well, it's kind of hard to describe. It doesn't take very long to do it, but it really makes it look great. And it looks like something that you might have spent weeks and months on, and actually you can do something in just a few hours. Makes a very attractive sign. There, and that's all there is to it. The sign is painted. Let me just show you what we've got here. Release the vise. Here, that's going to look great on my friend's cabin. One of the questions I get asked quite a bit is, where do I find good carving tools? And that's not an easy question to answer because good carving tools aren't something you can generally find in just any hardware store. Mine are made in generally Switzerland or Germany or England, and they're imported, and I purchase them through different mail order tool catalogs. But sometimes I need a tool that's sort of in between sizes and not something I can buy. And then it's sort of a challenge to have to go and find someone who can still make them the way they used to centuries ago. The other day I was fortunate to meet a master blacksmith at Cooperstown in New York, and he's going to be making me a tool, and I thought you might enjoy seeing how this is done. So why don't you come along, we'll take a look. We're here at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, where I'd like to meet a friend of mine, Paul Spaulding, who's a master blacksmith here. This is his shop. Let's see if he's in. Why don't you come on with me? Hello, Paul.
Oh, hi, Rick.
How you doing today?
Very well, thanks.
I need a special favor. I need a number 7 gouge, 16 millimeters wide with about a 5-inch blade, and I need it to fit my favorite handle here. So I have to have a tang and a shoulder arrangement so I can fit it inside.
No problem.
Great.
It's going to take a while. If you want to take a seat, we'll get right to it.
Okay, you don't mind if we watch?
Not a bit.
Terrific. Paul's shop is over 100 years old, and he still uses the same techniques that blacksmiths developed centuries ago. The first thing he does is to take a piece of 1% carbon tool steel and begin forming the tang. This tool is called a spring fuller, and it's used to shape the shoulder and tang. As the steel cools, it has to be reheated so it can be workable. Now he's drawing out the square, pointed tang of the blade. This is the end that fits into the wooden handle. Again, using another spring fuller and checking for the fit. A lot of these tools Paul uses are ones he made himself, just for this type of work. This is called upsetting the collar, where he forms that ridge around the tang. This keeps the blade from being driven too far into the wooden handle. This hammer is made just for doing this type of work. Now a final check of the fit, and it looks good.
Coming up.
Again, he's using a spring fuller, this time to form the shank in front of that shoulder. Now the blade can be drawn out by flattening it on the anvil. It always amazes me how soft the steel is once it's been heated up to this temperature. To form the sweep, or the curve of the blade, it's placed in a swedge block and then struck with a fuller hammer. This will give the blade its characteristic sweep. This old leather bellows is used to force air into the coal fire to make it really hot. This is necessary for the next step, which is called annealing. Here the blade is heated up to the critical temperature of the steel. This is about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and Paul judges the temperature by checking it with a magnet. As soon as the steel gets hot enough, the crystalline structure changes and it loses its magnetic properties. This is something that takes a lot of experience for the blacksmith. The blade is then placed in the ashes of the coal fire and allowed to cool slowly. This slow cooling softens the steel and relieves any internal stresses from the forging process. Now the final adjustments can be made on the sweep using an old foot-powered lathe. The next step is to harden the steel. Again, it's brought up to its critical temperature and quenched quickly. The blade is now polished on an old grinding wheel. This prepares it for the final step, the crucial tempering. This is done by placing the blade on a bar of red-hot steel. This slowly transfers the heat to the blade, and the blacksmith, by watching the colors that form, can judge the exact temperature.
Okay, we're ready now.
Now the steel is hard enough to hold a good sharp edge, but isn't too brittle to use as a gouge.
Well, there it is.
All right. Hey, that's beautiful, Paul. That is really neat. Let me see if that perfect fit, too. I can't wait to sharpen it up and use it on my next sign. Well, thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks for having us today. Really
My pleasure.
appreciate it. Very good. Next week, got an interesting little project we're going to be doing, classical whittler's puzzles. And I'll show you how to carve this pair of pliers out of one stick of wood. So until next time, this is Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
You can continue to learn wood carving with Rick Butz with his book, How to Carve Wood. This 224-page book of challenging exercises and projects is full of detailed instructions. Lessons include whittling, wildlife carving, and relief carving. To order your copy, call 1-800-950-9648.
Woodcraft, for all your woodworking needs. Tools, supplies, lumber, project plans, and educational workshops. With a mail-order catalog and stores nationwide. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.